Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Robert Fuentes. I am the president and CEO of the ENO Center for Transportation, and I want to welcome you to the latest in our series of ENO webinars. Today's webinar is a new paradigm for rail planning, funding, and implementation. And I am joined today, at least virtually, by four experts on the topic. Mitch Warren is here. I'll introduce everybody here in just a second. As I think most of you know, earlier this summer, the Northeast Corridor Commission released Connect NEC 2035, which is an ambitious and far-reaching investment program for rail in the Northeast. And given the nature of governance in the Northeast, it is necessarily a multi-agency effort. It includes state and federal governments. It includes 8 commuter rail agencies and Amtrak. And today we're going to hear about the C35 program, which is a detailed outline for how to implement the first phase of the Federal Railroad Administration's NEC Future Vision by sequencing infrastructure investments over the next 15 years in a way that both maximizes productivity and minimizes service disruption for customers in a busy commuter corridor. So we will take questions from the audience after the presentation. So please use the questions function on the webinar website to submit. You can send along questions anytime. You don't have to wait until we're done with the presentation. Let me just quickly introduce our guests. As I mentioned, we have Mitch Warren. He is the Executive Director of the Northeast Corridor Coalition. We also have Nicole Busich, the Planning Director for the Commission. Dennis Newman, the Executive Vice President, Planning and Strategy for Amtrak. And Rich Andriesky, the Bureau Chief for Public Transit in the state of Connecticut. All of their full bios are available on our website for the webpage that lays out this webinar. So we have a ton to cover here in just a short period of time. And we're going to kick it off with a short presentation. So now let me turn it over to Mitch Warren from the NEC. Take it away, Mitch.
All right, thanks a lot, Rob, and appreciate you and Eno hosting this webinar and giving us a chance to talk about the Commission and Connect NEC 2035. I'll start by giving a brief overview of the Northeast Corridor itself and the Commission, and then I'll pass it to Nicole Busich, who led the Commission's efforts to develop what we call C35, and she'll discuss the planning process and the plan itself before turning it over to Dennis Newman and Rich Andriesky. The Northeast Corridor, if you go to the next slide, is the busiest, most complex rail line in North America. Next slide. There we go. Pre-COVID, the corridor carried over 800,000 passengers a day on over 2,000 trains operated by 9 different passenger railroads and multiple freight railroads on track owned by 4 different entities. Given the importance of the corridor to the region's economy and transportation network, and given the planning and coordination challenges posed by having multiple owners and operators on this corridor, and also given the risks created by having an aging infrastructure that was primarily built between the Civil War and World War II, and then has been underinvested in ever since, Congress created the Northeast Corridor Commission to bring the key stakeholders together to improve coordination and to figure out how to fund the corridor and plan for its future. So our membership, if you go to the next slide, we have 18 voting members on the commission. 8 of them were appointed by the governors of the states between Maryland and Massachusetts. We also have the mayor of DC appoints 1 member, and these have generally been either the heads of the state DOTs or the relevant transit agency in the state. The next slide shows our membership representing US DOT. We have 5 members appointed by the secretary representing US DOT and the federal government, and 4 members from Amtrak appointed by the CEO of Amtrak. The commission meets 4 times a year. We also have a number of committees that also tend to meet quarterly, separate from the commission meeting. And the next slide shows the cost allocation policy. After our creation, we spent about 4 years of intense negotiations developing this cost allocation policy. You can see from the picture here that we borrowed Ben Franklin's Revolutionary War era cartoon to inspire us to make some difficult choices and tough compromises as we were working through this. The This policy is built with basically a policy framework that comes from this policy document, which is available on our website. But this policy framework has three pillars to it that it's built around. The first pillar is cost sharing, where we allocate over 1.3 billion a year of shared operating and normalized replacement capital costs based on usage of the corridor. The second pillar is improving collaboration, transparency, and accountability through better capital planning and regular reporting on train performance and the implementation of the capital program. And the third pillar of this partnership framework is the need for a federal-state partnership, particularly when it comes to funding. Many of our members were going to be investing more in the corridor as a result of this cost allocation policy, and they wanted to make sure that the federal government also stepped up to the plate as a partner. And we have had good relations and done good work with the federal government. The current members from DOT are actively engaged and an important part of everything that we do. And I could talk about this framework and the cost allocation policy for a long time, but we're here today to focus on Connect NEC 2035, which the commission completed this summer. C35, as we call it, it's a 15-year plan that details the first phase of the implementation of the NEC Future Plan that the Federal Railroad Administration completed in 2017. We announced C35 in July with a press conference at Moynihan Train Hall, and this video that we'll play provides an introduction.
This is Connect NEC 2035, a transformative 15-year action plan for the future of the Northeast Corridor. This system, including Amtrak and commuter rail services, has been the economic backbone of the region for the past 150 years, connecting people to work, school, and fun. But this mobility relies on outdated track, signal, and power systems, and uses bridges and tunnels that are over 100 years old. Connect NEC 2035 is a new way of doing business, the result of railroads and governments coming together as never before through the Northeast Corridor Commission in order to coordinate construction of 150 projects while minimizing service disruptions for customers. Among urgent needs for infrastructure investment across the U.S., rebuilding and improving the Northeast Corridor rail system is vital. Connect NEC 2035 is a comprehensive blueprint for efficiently building a modern, safe railroad. This means faster trains, saving 26 minutes between New York and Washington and 28 minutes between New York and Boston. Fewer delays. New direct and express services, plus off-peak and reverse-peak trains. New modern stations. Reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And 1.7 million new jobs. But this $117 billion plan needs a predictable funding source to train a larger workforce, buy equipment, and advance projects with the certainty that the money will be there each year to put shovels in the ground. This is our chance to rebuild the country's most important passenger railroad for the 21st century. This is Connect NEC 2035.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicole Busich and led the Connect NEC 2035 program for the NEC Commission. And so otherwise known as C35 is our nickname, and it is the most ambitious investment plan in the history of the Northeast Corridor. The NEC Commission member agencies came together as never before to develop a long-term investment plan for the busiest passenger railroad in the United States. The plan was financially unconstrained, which allowed us to look at a new way to deliver projects and to bring the corridor to a state of good repair. C35 was an unprecedented, detailed ground-up analysis of over 150 projects, plus capital renewal, focused on the efficient use of track outages in order to minimize the impacts to our customers and deliver results. Next slide, please. So the total investment needed to implement C35 was estimated at about $117 billion, with a funding gap of $100 billion. And that level of investment over a 15-year period would allow us to complete all of the major backlog bridge and tunnel projects and replace most of the aging assets along the corridor. This level of investment would bring significant benefits, not only to the Northeast, but to the entire country. It would improve mobility and connections for commuter and intercity passengers, providing more frequent, reliable, and faster service. It would create economic opportunity by generating jobs and providing service to underserved communities. It would support desirable cities and communities by improving rail access to current and future Northeast Corridor station area developments. And it would combat climate change by shifting riders to rail, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and making our infrastructure more resilient. Next, please. So as both Rob and Mitch mentioned, FRA's NEC Future was the starting point for our analysis, and C35 looked at the first 15 years of FRA's NEC Future vision to determine what we can accomplish by 2035. C35 Strategic Planning had three main guiding principles: service and capital, delivery, and financial. The service and capital strategy was the first step in which we worked collaboratively with all of the NEC member agencies to develop 2035 service objectives, which included increased frequency, improved travel times, and new service patterns for 2035. We also developed a list of infrastructure improvements that the agencies believed would be needed to achieve these objectives. The delivery strategy was the groundbreaking technical analysis that analyzed and sequenced both the 150 special projects as well as 120 capital renewal programs along the corridor. The analysis was able to test whether the projects could in fact deliver the 2035 service objectives. And then once we understood the level of investment required to bring the corridor to a state of good repair and achieve the service objectives, the financial strategy identified the gap between historic funding levels and what would be required to implement the plan, and identified an approach for closing that gap. Next slide, please. So at the start of any planning process, it's important to understand the existing conditions and challenges. And as Mitch mentioned earlier, the NEC pre-pandemic served more than 800,000 trips per day, but those commuter and intercity trips rely on bridges and tunnels that are over 100 years old. Failures and limitations of today's aging or outdated infrastructure contribute to train delays, and riders on the NEC already suffer approximately $1 billion in lost productivity due to service disruptions. Next slide, please. So today on the Northeast Corridor, most construction projects advance independently and rely on track outages that are scheduled on a ready-to-go basis. And this historic piecemeal approach is driven by the fact that funding has been competitive and uncertain. So just like a utility company that rips up the road in front of your house shortly after it's been repaved, when another project on the Northeast Corridor is identified in the same area, that same track is shut down again, impacting the same trains and the same customers. And the current approach not only impacts customers, but it's an inefficient use of workforce and equipment. Next slide. So we developed a new approach. In an unconstrained funding environment, how could we phase work most efficiently and bring the Northeast Corridor to a state of good repair in 15 years? So once individual project scopes and schedule were defined, they were grouped into geographic programs within each of the 5 Northeast Corridor territories. So starting from the north, we had New England, Connecticut Westchester, New York City Metro, Mid-Atlantic North, and Mid-Atlantic South. And the delivery of both capital renewal and special projects was then coordinated to avoid overlaps and find synergies. The delivery analysis tool that we created defined coordinated track outages and construction sequencing, and an iterative operations analysis allowed us to understand service impacts and viable service delivery. The result was a feasible deliverable sequence of all investments within each of the 5 Northeast Corridor territories. We defined workforce requirements, we defined service impacts, and the overall capital cost of investment over the 15-year period. Next slide. So you can hit play, please, at the bottom. Thank you. So when the delivery analysis was complete, we developed visuals like this to show progress over the 15-year timeframe. And this example is from the New York City Metro territory, which goes from New Rochelle, New York, on the northern end to Morris Interlocking in New Jersey on the southern end, in Pennsylvania on the southern end, and that's just south of Trenton Station. And so what this shows is tracks within the territory, which tracks are in service and which are out of service during different timeframes. What work is ongoing, that's in the gray box up top, and what work is complete, and that's shown in the blue box. And in this specific example, once the video plays through, you'll see that there are still some red tracks. And what this shows is that we were not able to program all of the capital renewal within the 15-year timeframe in this specific territory. Next, please. C35's analytical approach also accounted for the fact that the Northeast Corridor is a network of highly interdependent assets. For example, additional track capacity, let's say 30 miles from a major station, may not provide any service frequency benefits if there are other capacity choke points between that location and the station itself. So C35 considered each individual project in the context of the overall infrastructure to ensure that the sum of the plan is greater than its parts, advancing projects that collectively unlock measurable and significant benefits by 2035. Specifically, if the C35 plan were implemented, the Acela travel time between Boston and New York City would be reduced by 28 minutes, and the travel time between New York City and Washington, D.C. would be reduced by 26 minutes. And we would also have improved travel time for commuters, but the most significant change would be an increase in service reliability. Next, please. With an understanding of the challenges we faced, we developed 2 key principles for a new or restructured funding program to implement C35. The first was make funding predictable. Make it predictable to allow agencies to hire workforce, to buy equipment, and to engage in those timely and costly early pre-construction project development processes. The second one was to fund the plan rather than individual projects, to remain consistent with C35's collective synergies and efficiencies rather than the individual project merits. Next slide, please. So following the release of C35 this past July, and this picture shows the press conference that we had in Moynihan Train Hall. So following that release, Congress took steps to increase federal rail funding through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, otherwise known as IIJA. And that included a reformed federal-state partnership for intercity passenger rail grant program. So should the IIJA be enacted into law, project sponsors on the Northeast Corridor may seek to combine a mix of this new federal funding available through several programs with state and local sources to implement the C35 plan and advance projects in the most efficient way possible. The revamped Fed-state program will be a nationwide program, but the NEC projects will have a different selection process. Under the nationwide and NEC revamped program, USDOT would issue letters of intent and phased funding agreements to establish anticipated terms of participation by the federal government over the life of a project. And USDOT will also publish the NEC project inventory, taking into consideration the sequencing and phasing of projects in both the Commission's 5-year capital investment plan as well as the 15-year service development plan, which is C35. So the NEC project inventory will identify projects for investment and will specify the order in which USDOT will propose to make grant dollars available over a 2-year period. Next slide. C35 is a plan that was developed to determine the funding need to bring the Northeast Corridor to a state of good repair. And as we await the passage of IIJA, the Commission is continuing our planning efforts with an eye towards implementation to refocus the list of projects and capital renewal based on available funding and workforce ramp up. Next slide. So the C35 plan, as well as all of the Commission's published documents historically, can be found on our website. The link is here. And now I'll pass the presentation to Dennis Newman from Amtrak, who will highlight some of Amtrak's key C35 projects.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and good afternoon, everyone. As Rob said at the beginning, I'm Dennis Newman. I'm EVP of Planning and Strategy for Amtrak, and I thank the ENO Center for putting this webinar together and for having us. So as Nicole said, I'm going to go highlight a few of the key projects that are part of the C35 plan, and it's really just a few because there are very many, and Amtrak is somewhat unique as being the railroad that serves all the way along the Northeast Corridor. So it's very important to us to be able to have this kind of plan that's been put together and to have a body and a set of protocols and a process to work together with our many partners along the corridor so that we can do this planning and bring the corridor to a state of good repair. So to give a flavor for a few of the key programs and projects, I'd like to talk about 3 in particular. So one sort of on the south end, one in the middle, and one up north. So first, the Frederick Douglass Tunnel, which will be our replacement for the Baltimore and Potomac Tunnel, and then the Gateway program in New York, and then replacement of the Connecticut River Bridge up in New England. So next slide, please. So to talk about Bnp, so the existing Bnp Tunnel is nearly 150 years old. Actually, groundbreaking was 150 years ago this year, and so that was begun in the Grant administration. As you can see here, it's older than the Statue of Liberty. Pre-pandemic, would carry 9 million MARC and Amtrak passengers per year. So a very well-used tunnel. But like many of our aging infrastructure, it's got some issues, and so it's got a deteriorating structure. There's water both above and below the tracks. We do have a significant amount of maintenance that we need to do to keep the tunnel in good usable repair. We're lacking in redundancy and resiliency. It is a bottleneck, just both because of the amount of capacity, the 2 tracks it has, and the slow speeds that we need to operate under as we go through the tunnel, and it is also constrained for adding the appropriate systems that we need. Next slide, please. So as we build and seek to build a replacement for the Bnp Tunnel, which we have announced, we will be naming the Frederick Douglass Tunnel. after Frederick Douglass, who made his escape from slavery by boarding a train in Baltimore. The program will modernize this key section of the Northeast Corridor. So it includes building the new tunnel, as well as making track and system upgrades, and also building a new MARC station in West Baltimore. And it is one of the main bottlenecks that we have, because we can only go 30 miles per hour for stretches through the tunnel. When we do some straightening, have the newer, higher capacity tunnel, we'll be able to increase speeds considerably. So both by having a much more up-to-date facility, as well as a much more reliable and facile facility, will produce quite a few benefits. And the other thing that comes along with the work that goes with this program is bringing jobs and opportunity to the Baltimore area, and that is a key aspect of what we're able to accomplish through programs that we hope to be funding very shortly. If we can go to the next, we'll move up north a little bit. So the Gateway program is one that most people have heard of. I think a lot of people tend to think of it as being the tunnels. So that the Hudson Tunnel project that will build new tunnels under the Hudson, but there are actually quite a few projects that make up this program. And this picture gives that depiction and a little bit of the flavor for where we stand in terms of the status of different parts of the program. So building the concrete casings that the new tunnel our tracks will go into when they get into Manhattan under Hudson Yards. Parts of that have already been built, and more are to come. Other pieces are, in final design and pre-construction. The Portal North Bridge, as we'll talk about in a minute, is actually about to move to construction. And other pieces of the program that also produce capacity and reliability benefits are, still in design and advancing further. So let's talk about where we're kind of going here with the next slide. For a number of these different projects for 2021, really into 2022. So for the Hudson Tunnel project, record of decision was issued this year. We've acquired property that we need, and also in conjunction with our partners, the financial plan's been updated. Portal North Bridge, New Jersey Transit has awarded the contract so that we can move to construction in FY22. We are working on the components of Penn Station expansion, as well as the Hudson Yards concrete casing. And then we've got other pieces like a fourth track in Harrison, the Sawtooth Bridges, and a replacement for the Dock Bridge, which is right outside of Newark Penn Station. We're advancing each of those pieces as well. So many components, again, all of which need to be well coordinated with our partners along the corridor. And if we go to the next slide, and then moving up north again to give a little bit of a flavor, we have our bridge over the Connecticut River, which is another over 100-year-old asset. And as noted here, the oldest movable bridge between New Haven and Boston. Another place where our speeds are somewhat restricted. We'd get a little bit of speed benefit with this replacement, but largely it's a state of good repair project. Like many of the projects that are in our inventory, we've got a big backlog of work to bring this key asset up to a state of good repair. So we'll be moving here this year for an EPA reevaluation, move to 100% design on this project, and then hope to begin some of our preliminary construction. So these three programs and projects really just give a flavor, but it's really critical for us to work with our partners along the Northeast Corridor and at the Commission to as Nicole described, there's so much interaction that takes place along the corridor that it's absolutely necessary that we approach these in a coordinated fashion. And of course, this one is in Connecticut, and one of our partners who we coordinate closely with is Rich Andreski from Connecticut DOT. So I'm going to turn it over to Rich.
Dennis, thank you. And what a segue. Good day, everyone. Rich Andreski here from Connecticut DOT to talk a little bit about our Time for CT program. Little background. Next slide, please. One more. Connecticut, we here in Connecticut have the Northeast Corridor and call it the New Haven line. And while much of the 457 miles between Boston and Washington are owned by Amtrak, here in Connecticut, the state of Connecticut owns from the state line at Greenwich to New Haven. And we have been working with the Northeast Corridor Commission and Amtrak on a similar effort to improve the New Haven line Northeast Corridor to elevate, improve speeds and reduce travel time. And Governor Lamont, when he was elected, ran on a platform of improving travel time because it is critical to our economics here in Connecticut. Many of our households, our GDP, our population center is in Southwest Connecticut, and it's critical that that rail link work and work well. Next slide, please. You know, we had 3 strategic goals going into our analysis. Yes, increase speeds and reduce travel time were obviously top of the list, but we also wanted a program that was going to minimize disruption to our host communities. The rail line goes through very dense areas where homes and businesses abut the railroad, and we did not want to entertain at this point, taking of substantial new rights of way. We also wanted a plan that was realistic in terms of funding and phasing as money becomes available, that we could accelerate the work. And we looked at 3 key areas. So while much of what you've heard has been talking about railroad infrastructure, we also recognize that we had much to gain by looking at service changes in the way we deployed service, as well as a new rail fleet. The reason for that is a minute saved, regardless of how it is saved, is still a minute to the customer, right? So if you save a minute through reduced dwell time at a station, that's the same as a minute saved by realigning a track curve. Next slide, please. So the service enhancements begin next year. In summer of 2022, we will be introducing what we call Super Express. We'll be running trains between New Haven, Bridgeport, and Stamford into New York, both Grand Central, and we're having conversations about potential service to Penn Station as well. Travel time will be reduced by up to 10 minutes from New Haven, and that's without infrastructure improvements. So that's strictly with existing fleet and existing infrastructure. Next slide. On the infrastructure side, the difference here in the way we're approaching this is rather than doing projects, bridge projects, and then a catenary project, then a signal project, we're taking segments of railroad and rebuilding them from the ground up. So that includes signals and curves and other, bridge replacements. Our first project is Time 1. It's in the Bridgeport area, and we're looking to see if we can elevate those speeds to as much as 100 miles an hour. Right now, most of the railroad operates at 80 miles an hour. In many cases, there are some severe curves on the railroad which limit maximum speeds to 30 miles an hour. So we have plenty of room for improvement here, and the infrastructure will be the core focus going forward beyond next year. Next slide. The fleet. So we've got a fairly modern rail fleet of M8 multiple unit type of equipment that runs into Grand Central. That's powered by overhead catenary third rail. We're buying more of those. Those were needed before COVID, but with reduced ridership, the equipment is still needed because as we introduce more direct services and express services, we need that equipment to get down to New York City and back. We're looking at new rail cars and locomotives like the one featured here. Dual power, New Jersey Transit has run these for many years very successfully. These will enable services off of our diesel lines, our non-electrified lines, to go into Penn Station, which dovetails nicely with the gateway improvements you just heard about. Next slide. So what does this look like from a funding perspective? We have about $2 billion of work that's underway currently. We estimate another $7 to $8 billion is needed for some of the improvements I just described. This by no means is the end of the investment, but this gets us to a place where we can save up to 25 minutes of travel time and do that within a reasonable, what we define as a reasonable time period. People just, we can't wait to solve this problem. We need to begin now. And we're optimistic because the Northeast Corridor in Connecticut is the New Haven line, so we can leverage some of those Northeast Corridor dollars that we expect are coming our way very shortly. And the last slide, please. So, to wrap it up, we're going to deliver some benefits very soon through service. That means up to 80 hours saved. But what this plan does for us is get us back to a railroad that will best some of the historic travel times that we saw as many as 70 years ago. So we think in about a decade's time, we'll be able to drop that best travel time from 1 hour and 46 minutes all the way down to 1 hour and 21 minutes. This is really about economics and quality of life, right? We're improving the railroad here to allow people to live more productive lives, live more comfortably, have a better quality of life. These projects will happen and deliver benefits as they are implemented, and that's the key here, that we implement and gain benefit as the program gains momentum. And with that, thank you for listening. I'm going to turn it back over to Rob Fuentes for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich, and thanks to everybody for the really compelling and comprehensive presentation. I found it very interesting, and I know that folks watching found it interesting too. We've got a ton of questions that's come in, so I'm going to try to collect some of these and kind of organize them into a couple of key themes. But let me just start off with one that seems to be what a lot of folks are talking about. That Dennis, you walked through a lot of the key projects. And Nicole, I think you talked a little bit about this, but can you say a little bit more about the prioritization? Because it's an ambitious program. It can't all happen at one time. And one of you mentioned, this is also happening in the midst of a busy and active corridor anyway. So how do you think about the prioritization of the investments that you're trying to make that you've laid out here today?
Well, I could take I'll take a first crack at it, and then I'll let Nicole talk about C35 in particular. So, and as Nicole will describe, one of the things that was the aim of doing the work that Nicole has and others have spent quite a bit of time working on to produce is to find a practical and efficient way to sequence the projects. And so that's a piece of the prioritization. Beyond that, it's a complicated puzzle. It's both the, what is the degree of state of good repair need. So, how dire, I guess, dire is probably not the right word, but how immediate is the need for bringing any particular asset up to state of good repair? What's the funding situation, right? I mean, that is going to be a piece of this. We will have to, both as we see what goes on with the infrastructure bill, but one way or another, it requires a partnership, and there's coordination among the different parties and entities that will participate in making any of these projects happen. So that's a piece of the prioritization as well. And then, again, there are many different parties and players involved here, and so there are priorities for each of the participants in terms of what is, for our other partners, what's most important for their state or their agency, what can produce the biggest benefit for their communities and their ridership. So no simple answer there, but a lot of components go into the prioritization.
And Nicole, you talked a little bit about this when you were going through your presentation. Can you say a little bit more just for folks who listen?
Sure. I mean, echo everything that Dennis said. What I could add is that in commission world, we try not to use the word prioritization because we have so many stakeholders who have their individual priorities. I would say that C35, because we did the analysis funding unconstrained, our charge was to bring the corridor to a state of good repair. So what that inherently meant is that every single project and every piece of capital renewal was a priority. So in moving forward, as we continue our planning processes and working with all the commission member agencies, we having a funding constraint and knowing what the funding is coming in is going to help us, and addressing some of the workforce issues that we will face, and the entire country is facing in many different arenas, that we'll have to consider all that and have to sharpen our pencils and ask ourselves these tough questions. And we don't have answers yet, but that's what we're going to be working on.
And let's stick on. Oh, please.
And I was just going to add, Rob, as Nicole referred to, the different members have got their different priorities, and Rich touched on the benefits that the different projects produce, and that's what that is the other piece is time savings benefits and climate benefits, ridership capacity benefits. So that all goes into each of the individual partners' thoughts about which things need to get done. But as Nicole said, state of good repair is really kind of front and center.
Sure. And telling folks that the tunnel is older than the Statue of Liberty, I think, is also a very compelling stat. Certainly eye-opening to me. I can tell you a lot of the questions that are coming in, a lot of the interest is on funding and finance, right? So obviously it's a major ambitious plan here. As Nicole said, it's unconstrained. Can you say a little bit more about the funding piece of it? So how do you think about, are there predictable revenue sources that are coming in? Are there new revenue sources coming in other than the federal investment, which we know is I don't know what time it is, but could be happening right now. How do you think about those big funding and finance issues for really what is a gigantic set of investments?
Well, we've been really fortunate that the timing of C35 has really well aligned with the discussions in Congress and with the president on the infrastructure package. And the infrastructure bill really does mean everything. It makes all the difference in the world. It'd be by far the biggest reinvestment in the Northeast Corridor in its history. So that is critical to moving C35 forward, and the programs included in the infrastructure package, most importantly, the federal state funding partnership program. There's the Amtrak's NEC account, there's CRISI and RAISE and the new mega project program. There's a lot of different, of course, there's the transit programs and CIG, a lot of programs that can provide funding for these projects. So I've been working on these issues for decades now, and it's always been really hard because there's never money. It's always been underinvesting and trying to scrape by. In the years I've been working on this, there were many years in a row where Amtrak year to year didn't know whether they'd go bankrupt or exist. And it's been much better recently, but in 20 years ago, it was much more dire. So if this can happen, it really would create a path to moving these projects forward, and it provides predictable funding too, which is almost as important as the funding itself, so that agencies can hire the workforce that's needed, buy the equipment, buy the materials, enter into contracts to move these expensive and complicated projects that are going to take many years to construct. So having the funding certainty will be huge. So this is a much different conversation with IIJA out there, fingers crossed that something happens soon, than it would have been without it, because it really would have been really difficult to do. Nicole talked about the advances we're trying to make in terms of making sure that we get the maximum productivity out of every track outage, and that requires sequencing projects and having predictable funding, so you know how things are going to move forward, and that's only possible with something like the IIJA. And then, of course, the states and commuter railroads are going to have to provide matching funds, and they'll have to commit dollars as well. That'll be an important part of this. But the IIJA and then, of course, the annual appropriations process to supplement that are critical.
Well, a couple of folks are wondering, and this is just to kind of collect some of these together. So, I mean, obviously, we're living through a time of transformation when it comes to transportation demand. A lot of folks think we're going to be bouncing back in a couple of years. Other transit agencies and others have their predictions. Commuter rail is hit particularly hard by the pandemic. So, is there an element of COVID-related demand drops that you factor in here? Do you think about anything related to what we're going through now that fit into this fit into your program?
I can start answering this question. And we did consider COVID. I mean, a lot of the projections we made and considering future ridership and what that means in terms of folks shifting to rail, we backed off the projections a few years. I believe it was 4 or 5 years. I don't remember exactly, to just have a more realistic sort of end number. But when you think about commuter service specifically, but this goes for intercity service. There's a sort of a minimum level of service you have to provide, no matter how many riders you have. You're still served. There are many people who have continued to travel on rail throughout the pandemic because their job required them to. So, we have a corridor that is not in a state of good repair, and it is first and foremost important for us to bring that corridor to a state of good repair so we can continue serving these passengers, no matter how many they are. And of course, we collectively, as a commission, are looking forward to the rails picking up. I personally have been commuting a bit more lately, and every time I see a semi-crowded train, I'm pretty happy about it.
Yeah, I'm here in downtown Washington. I've definitely seen an uptick since November 1st. I think people are certainly back. And your point is very well taken. I think that if there were a bunch of big extensions and a lot of new service capacity that way, that would be one thing. But you're right, it is about just getting the system into the condition that it needs to be in.
Yeah. And Rob, I was just going to say the fact that there's a little bit of a blip in demand here, it gives us a little bit of room before that. Capacity constraint was there before, and it'll be back, right? So that gives us a little bit of room. But as Nicole said, the state of good repair needs to be put in place in any case. So similar to you, I've definitely seen the uptick here, even just in the past couple of weeks. So.
And anyone who's ridden the corridor knows where those pinch points are. It's not like it's enormous insights. I mean, we know where in Baltimore and other places where the delays are. The corridor is also very unique, as we said at the beginning, due to the multiple states and the major metros through which it travels. So what challenges does governance face? I mean, you went out of your way to talk about the collaborative nature and how everybody works together, but clearly having a whole lot of actors has to be somewhat challenging, or might have its own issues to deal with. Rich, maybe for you, how do you think about the multiple agency nature of what you're trying to achieve here?
What I think is exceptional about what Mitch and Nicole have done too in pulling this plan together is building a coalition and figuring out how to reconcile sometimes competing desires and goals. And what I've seen is a lot of a movement towards a common understanding of what needs to get done. There's definitely going to be impacts to the different parties and states and communities, but there's probably arguably never been a better foundation for us to move forward. I mean, we've got at least a decade under our belts now as you know, the Northeast states working on rail, and so the relationships are there. I feel very good about that, and I also think that the federal partners are more aligned than they've ever been. You know, we've got great leadership at FRA and FTA, and they're talking, and we're looking at reconciling Buy America and environmental, and you know, I think we're going to spot, not to minimize the challenges. I think the challenges are great, but we also I think the lines of communication are open, and there's a desire to get this done.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the complexity of the different owners and operators and the different entities involved is significant, and it's why the commission was created, and it's sort of our specialty is bringing all these folks together. And the corridor's a network, right? So what you do in New York and New Jersey impacts Connecticut, it impacts Maryland and states up and down the corridor. What happens in Connecticut impacts New York and Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So you have to have the coordination and communication, especially in planning these track outages. You need a track outage in one place is going to impact service a state or two away, and you have to be able to coordinate between Amtrak and the commuter railroads, multiple commuter railroads, to make sure that the track outages that we plan happen when they're planned, and all these projects can move in sequence. And again, that gets back to the importance of the IIJA and providing the predictable funding so that these projects do have a better chance of moving forward on schedule. And it's going to be implementation. This is going to be extremely complex because of all the different entities. And that's going to be a challenge we're all going to have to work together on, is to make sure that communication and coordination happens, so that we can maximize the productivity of these outages and make sure these projects move forward according to plan.
And the point is very well taken, that without I mean, it's a complex governance structure no matter what. Without the commission, it would be even more difficult to get things done. It's a very good point. So, I mean, you mentioned IIJ. We talked about that a bunch, and you know, hopefully that's going to resolve itself pretty soon. But other places around the United States are dealing with their own kind of rail investments, and IIJ is going to have, you know, big national impacts. We have a national audience here today. So, what advice would you have for folks who are not in the Northeast corridor as they're wrestling through their own their own issues with this stuff, whether it's from the Southeast or the Midwest, and certainly have folks here on the West Coast? So what advice would you have folks outside of the Northeast?
This is Dennis. I could jump in, since actually I talked to a lot of those folks around the rest of the country, and obviously IIJA has got some funding intended for the national network, you know, both to Amtrak and then to you know, through the Fed state process. So you know, I think, again, looking at things, one thing I would say that is particularly relevant to the discussion we've been having is being able to look at things on a regional basis, and you know, obviously there are some routes that are wholly within a state, but in many cases there is you know, we as the intercity passenger rail carrier are often also an interstate passenger rail carrier, and so, you know, trying to coordinate with one's neighbors, and also even within one locality, there are going to be multiple constituencies, you know, different commuter railroads, different agencies. So that cooperation and cooperative planning, I think, is critical.
Yeah, I could add to that. It's the statement I made earlier, some of the plan is greater than its parts. You know, my advice to others would be having a plan that is agreed upon by stakeholders that you can go to and look to for future work is extremely important as you move forward. If you have competing projects or competing thoughts about strategy or goals, you're never going to be able to accomplish an end game. And then just picking up on what Mitch has said a couple times is having dedicated funding, having a funding stream and having a plan allows you to get work done, whether it be pre-construction or construction activities. I think that those two, would be advice I'd give.
Sure. So a bunch of other folks are wondering about the role of freight in all this. The Northeast Corridor is different for lots of different reasons, but one is that the passenger rail operators own most of the trackage. It's a corruption of the truth, but you know what I mean. So, but in most of the parts of the country, the freight rail companies own the tracks. What role does freight rail have in the Northeast Corridor when it comes to the plan you laid out here?
Well, go ahead.
Well, I mean, in Connecticut, we do have freight, like most places on the Northeast Corridor, and we have ways to provide the freight carriers with alternate routes, right? So although freight needs to be accommodated, it does not always need to be accommodated over the Northeast Corridor, although they have operating rights to do so. I think that conversation needs to happen with the freight carriers, and if there are investments that can be made off corridor that facilitate, freight operations, that needs to be in the mix.
It is very different in the Northeast Corridor for lots of different reasons. A couple of things too around climate resiliency. I mean, just broadly, how does the national priority, this administration has talked about it, many of the states have talked about it, how does climate resiliency manifest itself in the plan, other than the obvious thing that the rail probably has a positive effect? You think about the impact on the infrastructure itself. Should there be something like we have with Superstorm Sandy that affected the rail network? How do you think about climate resiliency with the plan?
I can take that.
Go
I'm sorry.
ahead.
Okay. I would say you said it earlier. I mean, we have the benefit of having one of the least carbon emitting modes out there, and so it's not hard to make the argument that if you improve rail and you can attract people out of more emitting modes, especially in the Northeast Corridor, there's sort of a combination of air, bus, auto, that it's sort of competing market. So that's clear. But in terms of resiliency, I mean, every project as designed in the future, and we made sure we had this conversation as we discussed projects moving forward, are built with resiliency in mind. I mean, since Superstorm Sandy, it's not just the New York region, everywhere in the country that is, sort of part of the plan. But I will say also, another way to look at resiliency is having alternative routes. So there's projects like, for example, Penn Station Access in New York moving forward provides service from Connecticut into Penn Station. It's providing another outlet. If for some reason you couldn't have service into Grand Central, it allows people a way to get home. So it's duplicative service, it's redundant service. That also is sort of another way to look at about a measure of having a resilient transportation system.
Yeah, and I would just echo what Nicole said. We are, as we're constantly doing capital renewal on the railroad, we're looking to be hardening the infrastructure, making it resilient and sustainable. But many of these big projects that are part of our 15-year plan have a very significant component to them of improving the resiliency of that infrastructure. So
goes hand in hand, I think, in a lot of ways. We're just about out of time here. Just one more very quick question, maybe for Mitch. There, as we've talked about, there's no corridor quite like the Northeast Corridor. So who do you look to for advice and best practices, either domestically or abroad? Again, it's so unique in the United States. Who do you look to for any kind of advice for what you do with the commission?
It is unique, and it does make it hard to find other models. You know, we've looked around, we've looked at big, and Nicole might be able to jump in too, but we've looked at some big initiatives out west on, you know, was it Measure M, and you know, to look at how they've tried to plan those big initiatives and how they've implemented them. But it really is hard to find anything that's like the Northeast Corridor, where we have so many different entities, you know, states and transit agencies and commuter railroads and freight railroads, and you have Amtrak as the nation's intercity railroad, and of course the federal government. You know, we really haven't found many good models, so we've made our way, and luckily have had a great partnership with the federal government. We work very, very well with US DOT, with Congress. Amtrak has always been a critical player on the corridor, and certainly with the commission, and the commission's helped bring the states into it more, which I think is extremely helpful, because sometimes they weren't always part of the planning and the thinking and the funding, and now they're much more engaged in all this. And with C35, a lot of these projects are going to have state partnerships, and it's going to be very important. So you know, I think we've come a long way in bringing those key players together, but it really has been hard to find other similar models.
And it's not for lack of trying. And you know, we found examples of, you know, singular agencies that are developing plans that have hundreds of projects, and then we've found examples of multiple agencies working together on one project or one or two projects, but certainly not the combination that we have. So if anyone out there listening has a really good example, reach out to us.
That's great. Well, you heard it from Nicole. So if you do have ideas, again, I know we've worked with these folks before. If you do want to reach out and you do have suggestions, I'm sure they'll be open to all ideas. So I just want to thank everybody for, you know, thank the team here for your participation. Thank you for everybody who's joined us here live. This was a really interesting and stimulating discussion. We knew we weren't going to be able to get through everything, and I would encourage everybody to check out the C35 plan. As was noted, it's on the Northeast Corridor Commission's website. There's a link in the chat. It should be too hard to find anyway. If you all would like more information about ENO, including our ongoing webinar series, our virtual events, our classes, and our coursework, you can check out our website, www.enotrans.org. And obviously, with everything going on with the federal bill, when you're there, you should check out ENO Transportation Weekly, written by Jeff Davis. It's an invaluable resource to all things on transportation policy and practice, especially what's going on here in federal Washington. So once again, my deep thanks to Mitch, Nicole, Dennis, and Rich, to all of you for joining us. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you all.